Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My point of departure is the universal destination of the goods of the earth and the state as the principal arbiter in the process. I make a distinction between the state and the nation state with the proviso that in the case of the nation state, besides the political legal bindings, there are also affective elements of belongingness, some sentiments about being part of a state. And proceed to hypothesize that the nation state is better placed to effect this universal destination of the goods of the earth simply because there are less competing demands in the nation state. I then proceed to an empirical examination of the distributive capacity of the African state to test this hypothesis. Almost all African states experience colonialism of one form or the other, particularly European colonialism. Almost all have a low human development index and a high Gini coefficient. They almost all have fractured histories and contradictory trajectories. In an attempt to look at the cause, one comes across weak and fragile states, as is stated that between 1960 and 2012, African states have witnessed over 200 military coups, with 45% of them being successful and resulting in a change of government. Further, the authors aver that of the 51 African states selected in the sample, 10 countries have never experienced a coup, and remarkably, those that have not experienced any coup tend to have better human development indices and experience a measure of social and political stability. And they name these countries as Mauritius, Tunisia, Botswana, South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco, in that order. And among the countries that have not experienced military coups, only 2 seem to be having low human development indices, and these are Malawi and Eritrea. I then go to try and trace the development of the African state from a historical perspective. And here there are 2 competing paradigms, not necessarily in opposition to one another. One is the political economy paradigm, stipulating that the raison d'etre for European colonialism in Africa was the exploitation of resources, and that the formation of the African state was predicated on the European metropoles willing to extract resources from Africa, and therefore the boundaries of the African state were drawn in accordance with the needs of the colonial powers, particularly taking into account the Berlin Treaty of 1884. However, Mamdani adds to this by stipulating that it was not only the exploitative shape that mattered as much as it was the legal arrangements that colonial powers imposed on the African sociology. One, that there was a distinction between race and ethnicity, and only the colonizers belonged to a race that had rights and civil liberties, while the ethnics or the indigenous people were subjected to ethnic law, whereupon there was not just one single ethnic law, but a number of specific ethnic laws, therefore adding to the seeds of disintegration in the future. However, going into the history, while African nationalists project a rosy picture of the pre-colonial state, there are quite similarities to a degree between the pre-colonial and the post-colonial state. One, the social stratification, that even before colonialism, African states were highly socially stratified. Colonialism, of course, added to the social stratification by adding into or building or institutionalizing economic stratification. Now, this caused certain psychological trajectories. The commons or commoners who had anyway not enjoyed any measure of civil rights acquiesced in the colonial state because in their case there was not much change in their material circumstances. But the elites who had enjoyed a measure of superiority compared to the commons took the lead in the formation of liberation movements and galvanized mass support. The resultant, therefore, was that the post-colonial state was, as a function or as a product of the liberation movements, was brought into it a contrived form of nationalism, which succeeded in liberating the states or the people, but did not succeed in creating a common nationalism. Well, events in a way overtook them. The capacity to perform in a complex international and globalized economic system became too much, and there was a breakdown, hence the number of coups d'etats and military uprisings, etc. This eventually led to the dependence on these states on European and American capital, which in turn imposed certain conditionalities in the democratization of the state as the problem for underdevelopment was diagnosed as lack of development. So in order to effect this development, the conditionalities called upon the states to democratize, as they had deteriorated into one-party fiefdoms and a number of authoritarian states or with authoritarian tendencies. And this process of democratization was referred to as the structural adjustment programs. I think that history is quite well known to many of us of what happened thereafter. There were a number of African states that held elections. However, still there was a lot of tampering with these elections, as the elites had been entrenched into what I call the contemporary factor. And this contemporary factor goes like this. The African president looks at himself in line with the American or the European president. Materially feels that he also has to enjoy the kudos that the co-presidents enjoy, irrespective of the material basis. And this has led to the politics of entrepreneurship, where political office in Africa goes hand in hand with material acquisitions. And this is probably what is Africa's most greatest problem as it goes at present. I therefore try to create a case study by using South Africa as probably a case of this issue. South Africa, despite its colonial span lasting over 3 centuries, was the last African state to gain independence from an internal colonial power whose origins lay in Europe. South Africa attained its independence in 1994 when the African National Congress, the oldest African liberation movement, came into power and has continuously governed the country since then. South Africa's demographics reflect a cultural mosaic of 5.6 million people with 4 major population groupings comprising 79.2 indigenous Africans, 8.92 coloureds, 8.86 whites, and 2.49 Indians. The racial classification is significant in understanding and explaining the national question and the political cultural configurations regarding the nature and dynamics of the nation state. Secondly, the racial classification does not necessarily imply social cohesion within race, as further segmentation, for instance, ethnicity and language, exists within race. For instance, within the white race are the English and the Afrikaners as the main language groupings, while Africans have 2 main language groups, the Nguni and the Sotho, and 2 minor variants, the Tsonga and the Venda. Nor are Indian and colored groupings monolithic, as they too have a number of constituent variants. The Nguni have 4 major subgroupings, while the Sotho have 3. This is what makes South Africa a multicultural state. There is definitely a common allegiance to a political legal entity, judging by the fact that neither have there been challenges to the state nor attempts at secession. At the political level, the Constitution anchored around a Bill of Rights and a number of institutional checks and balances appears to be the rallying point around which a common South Africanism exists, while socially the various segments, ethnic and racial, are very salient. Parallel to this, material circumstances have created economic segments, rendering South Africa a class society with a Gini coefficient varying between 0.67 and 0.70, making it the most unequal society in the world. Recognizing these disparate constituents that comprise the South African state, Mandela created an ideological rallying point, the Rainbow Nation, reflecting unity in diversity, leading personally and morally by example, and in the spirit of creating an egalitarian society and consequently a common citizenry. Mandela, for instance, even intervened when members of the national legislature did dare to raise issues of an increase in the salaries of parliamentarians. His rationale was that there was much poverty in the population to warrant showing restraint from wanting increased payments by the political elite. Such was the determination to create a nation state that the national anthem had to reflect this unity in diversity. The anthem is multilingual, with the first section in the Nguni language drawn from the original hymn, which the ANC had adopted as the anthem long before liberation. The second section is the Sotho language. The third is in Afrikaans, drawn from the previous anthem, which the National Party government had adopted as the South African anthem on breaking away from the British Commonwealth. And the final section is in English. The new national state adopted 11 official languages, 9 indigenous, and 2 representing the former dominant white languages. However, English has become the most commonly used language of communication and in education across all sections of the population, mainly because of its universal applicability. Despite the pretensions of a rainbow nation, the allegiance to the Constitution and a common economy and the use of English as a language across all sectors of the population, a relatively healthy educational attainment, South Africa still remains socially and economically a deeply divided society and hardly a nation. Residentially, over 80% of rural residents are indigenous Africans, and the majority of them are poor. Racial residential separation is also a norm among the applicant population, with the townships and sheikh settlements entirely black, and poorly endowed with resources and amenities, while urban suburbs present the opposite picture. Subsequent to liberation in 1994, well-to-do Africans, mostly black, moved away from the townships into the suburban areas. But in turn, wealthy whites moved away from these suburban areas into the much more richer areas. However, as there is no law demanding separation, rich Africans followed. Therefore, there are very rich areas in South Africa with huge malls for shopping and all the other things, definitely no less than one would experience in Europe or the United States, and yet they are still very poor areas. But on top of this, social services are also highly stratified, not legally, but empirically. As for instance, South African life has been highly privatized. If one is rich, one can send one's children to a very rich elite school, while the ordinary schools, plagued by poor resources as well by a very poor ethic, have become the plague of the poor. Similarly also, if one has medical aid, one can get treated or treatment in a very wealthy hospital with all the materials, while ordinary people queue for these services. This has made South Africa to be commonly known as the protest capital of the world. And these protests are very ugly. Not only are they protests, but they are also quite violent. So it is not uncommon for protesting groups to burn tires in the streets, march into, if it is the health workers that are protesting, they can march into hospitals, rip off intravenous drips from patients' arms, enter operating theaters when people are under operation, and literally disturb the works there. Such is the culture of the South African political situation. In addition, another not very comfortable development took place in an attempt to create wealth equally. They illegally established what is called the Black Economic Empowerment Clause, which placed restrictions on how employers and state services were to be quoted, giving preferential treatment to what they call the previously disadvantaged groups. This has caused a lot of problems, and not only between black and white, who refer to it as reverse racism, but also among black themselves as the stratification of blacks prior to apartheid into colored Indian and indigenous Africans seems to be disturbed by this black economic empowerment, with the indigenous blacks maintaining that Indians and coloreds were relatively privileged under apartheid and therefore have to take second seat with this regard, or in this regard. So there are these contradictions in the South African situation where definitely because of the strength of the democratization process, which I refer to as the illusion of democracy, there is a relative relaxation with regard to expression, freedom of expression. Nobody gets even chased by the police or followed by the police for expressing themselves. The press, referred to as the third estate, is very free, or not only the press, the media, even television. One gets a lot of exposure of the corruption of the elite through television and radio, through the press, and there are commissions of inquiry looking into these issues of corruption. At present, 3 of them are sitting as I speak now, and there is a lot of exposure of elite corruption. The extent to which this will go, I do not know, but there is general hope that it might result in taking legal action against them. All this creates an illusion of freedom, such that there are no challenges to the South African state. I mean, there are not even challenges of federalism. It's not a word that's spoken about. The ethnicity that people talk about on a daily basis, it's not really a problem in terms of the existential lives of citizens. People just don't hardly talk about it, excepting a few commentators. But at the same time, gross inequalities, particularly economic inequalities, exist. Now, I close this paper by going back to Africa and saying, notwithstanding the dominant view of ailing states, the relative quiescence of the masses, especially in the period after the contrived democratization following structural adjustment programs, partly explains the ambiguous position of the African state. The citizenry has not contested the state. What is at issue is how the state administers civil liberties and citizen entitlements. African nationalism was, in essence, a nationalism of the elite, with the masses supporting the leadership as they had always supported the traditional elite. Stated precisely, the absence of revolutionary attempts on the part of the general citizenry to destroy the state is a function of both psychological sentiments and an acknowledgement of the pragmatic role of the state. The nation-state project thus constitutes the hope and promise, the dream that tomorrow might most likely bring in the promised cargo. I thank you.